Imagine a world with no Google Maps, no digital calendars, no online banking, no mortgage, no apartment lease, no 9-to-5 grind. Now imagine that world stretching not just across one lifetime, but across millennia. Because for most of human history, and not just a few exceptions, staying put was the strange thing. The idea of settling down is modern, and more than that, it's cultural. It's not hardwired into human nature. In fact, if you go back far enough, it starts to look more like a deviation than a destination. In ancient Greece, the word for a truly wise man was sophos. But these men weren't known for building empires. They wandered. Diogenes slept in a wine barrel. Crates of Thebes gave up his fortune to roam the streets. In India, the sannyasins gave up home and family to wander barefoot through forests. In Islamic history, some of the greatest scholars, like Ibn Battuta or Al-Ghazali, spent decades on the road, refusing to stay in one place long enough to be claimed. Why? Because the search for truth required it. In a world without mass printing or the internet, wisdom wasn't something you downloaded. It was something you chased. Ideas were oral. Traditions were regional. Teachers were rare. If you wanted to learn, you had to walk. But it wasn't just practical. Wandering had symbolic power. It meant freedom. It meant detachment. It meant resisting the pull of status, wealth, and comfort. The very things modern life tells us to build our lives around. And most importantly, it meant staying open. Open to contradiction, to reinvention, to the idea that who you are today doesn't have to be who you are tomorrow. Modern culture calls this rootlessness. They called it enlightenment. In this video, we'll explore how movement, physical, mental, and spiritual, became a method of wisdom. Why settling down often meant settling for less, and what we've lost by staying still. Because while today's world worships stability, history tells a different story, one where the wisest people refused to stop moving. Let's follow one of them. His name was Al-Ghazali. Born in 1058 in the Persian city of Tus, he was a rising star, a scholar's scholar. By his mid-30s, he had it all: prestige, wealth, the top teaching position in Baghdad at the Nizamiya, the Harvard of the Islamic world. And then he walked away. Literally. One morning, in the middle of a lecture, he stopped speaking. His voice just vanished. For weeks, he couldn't talk without choking. He described it later as a spiritual paralysis, a moment where everything he'd built suddenly felt hollow. So he left. He told no one where he was going. He faked a pilgrimage, gave away his possessions, and disappeared into the desert. For 11 years, he wandered, not in search of money, not fame. He scrubbed floors in mosques, lived in isolation in Damascus, meditated in a minaret for months, walked the streets of Jerusalem, sat in silence with mystics, debated with skeptics, refused titles, refused comfort. He studied the soul like a surgeon studies wounds, and something shifted. He returned years later, not as the same man, but as someone emptied, stripped of academic pride, grounded in experience. His great work, the revival of the religious sciences, wasn't just theology. It was a psychological handbook about ego, about fear, about what we cling to when we forget we're going to die. And he never fully returned to the spotlight. He stayed on the edge of the city, taught small groups, refused high office. To him, the journey wasn't a detour. It was the method, a necessary dismantling of self. What would have happened if he had stayed in Baghdad? Kept the job, the applause, the stability? We wouldn't be talking about him today. Al-Ghazali wasn't wise in spite of walking away. He was wise because of it. So how exactly did Al-Ghazali and others like him use wandering as a method for attaining wisdom. It wasn't random, it wasn't just escape. There was a structure to it, a deliberate unlearning. First, they practiced withdrawal, not just from place, but from identity. Al-Ghazali didn't announce a sabbatical. He vanished. Crates of Thebes gave away his wealth in a single act. The goal was to shed the masks that society handed them. Teacher, philosopher, son, citizen, and confront the raw self beneath. Second, they immersed in contrast. They didn't just isolate, they exposed themselves to wildly different environments. A Sufi dervish might serve soup to the poor one week and sit in a mountain cave the next. The point was dislocation, to be a foreigner, to be confused. Because confusion makes you pay attention. Third, they slowed time. In modern life, movement usually means rushing, but for the wandering scholar, movement slowed things down. Walking across a desert, you have to think. Eating only when you find food, sleeping only when there's shade. These are deeply reflective rhythms. They hollow you out in the best sense. Fourth, they sought direct transmission, not books, not summaries, conversations, encounters. Al-Ghazali sought out the Sufis not to study about God, but to feel what they felt. Wisdom wasn't theoretical. It was embodied. It passed through stories, gestures, silences. And finally, they engaged in deliberate return. The goal wasn't to wander forever. It was to return transformed. Like the hero's journey. Exit, ordeal, reintegration. Al-Ghazali came back, but on his own terms. So did Buddha. So did countless sages. The leaving wasn't the end. It was a ritual of rebirth. Today, we call this a breakdown. They called it a pilgrimage. What looks like drifting was, in truth, a system. Strip away your roles. Enter uncertainty. Absorb new truths. Return changed. And the price of that wisdom? Letting go of the illusion that standing still means stability. Why did this wandering method work so powerfully? Because it rewired the mind, not with ideas, but with experience. Modern psychology is finally catching up to what these ancient sages understood intuitively. The environment shapes the self. And when you change your environment radically, your internal dialogue can't stay the same. First, there's the collapse of ego continuity. When you're always in one place, surrounded by people who reflect back the same version of you, your job title, your habits, your reputation, you get trapped in a feedback loop. You become a character in a story you can't edit. Wandering breaks the loop. New places don't know your past. They don't care. So you stop performing. You start observing. Second, there's the heightened presence that comes from being disoriented. When you're not sure where you'll sleep or where the path goes, your senses sharpen. Your attention returns. The modern world bombards us with stimulation, but it flattens our awareness. These wanderers lived slowly but intensely. Every moment was felt, because it had to be. Third, they created what today's cognitive scientists call liminal space, transitional zones where identity dissolves. These are the places where transformation becomes possible. It's why rites of passage happen away from home, why myths send heroes into the wilderness. Wisdom doesn't grow in comfort zones. It grows at the edge of the known. And finally, wandering imposed friction, the good kind. In a society obsessed with convenience, we've eliminated the very conditions that foster reflection. Walking for days, listening instead of reading, speaking to strangers in new dialects. These weren't distractions. They were invitations to listen more deeply, to others and to yourself. In short, wandering didn't just symbolize detachment. It created it. neurologically, emotionally, spiritually. And that's what modern life forgets. You can't think your way into a new self. You have to move your way into it. But here's what most modern self-help misses. These ancient wanderers weren't lone wolves. They existed within ecosystems that made their detachment possible, and even honored it. In medieval Islamic culture, there was the concept of the fakir, the poor seeker of divine truth. Cities like Nishapur, Cairo, and Fez had entire neighborhoods that offered food and lodging to traveling scholars, dervishes, and mystics. In India, forest-dwelling sannyasins were fed and protected by local villages. In China, itinerant Chan monks could knock on temple doors and be given shelter without question. Hospitality was more than etiquette. It was a social duty. And with that duty came a kind of permission structure. Society didn't just tolerate wandering. It validated it. To renounce the world wasn't seen as failure or laziness. It was seen as courage, as sacrifice. The same way we admire people today who quit high-paying jobs to find themselves, these cultures had a place for that role, and often revered it. There were also institutional supports. Al-Ghazali could travel for years because the Waqf system, Islamic charitable endowments, funded schools, lodging houses, and soup kitchens for wayfarers. Buddhist monasteries functioned like nodes in a network. You could move from one to another and never be truly alone. Even the cynics in Greece had followers who helped preserve their sayings and identities long after they'd died. And perhaps most importantly, the idea of truth was collective. You didn't seek wisdom just to optimize your own life. You sought it for the community, to bring back insight, to realign your people with the sacred, to prevent decay. The return of the wanderer wasn't a quiet retirement. It was a reintegration, a ripple effect. Think of Moses coming down from the mountain. Think of the Bodhisattva delaying nirvana to help others. Contrast that with today. Modern life treats wandering as a breakdown, something to explain, or justify, or hide. But in those older worlds, it was a stage of life, a phase, a respected role in the human drama. Wisdom wasn't privatized, it was a gift, and the community made space for the people brave enough to go out and find it. Of course, the wandering path wasn't always noble, and it didn't always work. When it succeeded, it produced people like Al-Ghazali, seekers who left society, saw deeper truths, and returned with something profound. But when the conditions weren't right, when the journey lost its grounding, it could become something else entirely. Madness, obscurity, even exploitation. Take the Greek cynics. At their best, they challenged materialism, performed street theater to expose hypocrisy, and reminded society of deeper values. But in later generations, many descended into parody, shocking for shock's sake. Some became beggars who mimicked Diogenes without his depth. The wisdom got reduced to style. Or consider the case of Chinese scholar recluses during the late Ming dynasty. Many withdrew from corrupt imperial courts and lived in nature, producing some of the most beautiful calligraphy and philosophy of the era. But as reclusion became fashionable, a new problem emerged: performative detachment. Men who claimed to renounce power while quietly longing for recognition. Isolation turned into elitism. The purity collapsed under pretense. So what made the difference? 3 conditions. First, inner readiness. Wandering amplified what was already inside you. If you left with resentment or ego, that's what the road gave back. But if you left with sincerity and humility, the journey deepened it. Second, social anchors. The successful wanderers weren't entirely alone. They had teachers, letters exchanged with peers, oral lineages. They left society, but they weren't cut off from it. Third, a return point. The journey was never meant to be permanent exile. The great wanderers returned, if not physically, then intellectually. They wrote, they taught, they passed it on. The ones who disappeared entirely often left little more than rumors. So yes, wandering could liberate, but only when it was rooted in something deeper than escape. And that's the irony. To walk away meaningfully, you have to know what you're walking toward. So what changed? Why did we stop seeing wandering as wisdom and start seeing it as failure, immaturity, or even danger? The shift didn't happen overnight, but if we had to name the moment the door closed, it would be the Industrial Revolution. Before machines, movement was part of life. People followed the seasons, the trade routes, the oral storytellers. Work was cyclical, not linear. Homes were temporary. Identity was flexible. Even medieval guild apprentices spent years on the road, traveling from town to town, to learn from different masters. It was expected. But then the factory arrived, and with it came the punch clock, the mortgage, the career ladder. Entire systems built on predictability and fixed roles. Governments began tracking populations. Schools trained children for obedience and uniformity. Vagabonds and wanderers, once tolerated or even admired, became threats to order. Laws changed too. In 1530, England passed the Act for Punishment of Sturdy Vagabonds, criminalizing homelessness. Across Europe, the romantic figure of the traveling scholar was replaced by the image of the vagrant, someone suspicious, someone without roots. The same pattern repeated in colonial systems. Indigenous nomads were forcibly settled. Movement became something to control. Even religion adapted. Pilgrimage, once a central spiritual act, became less common, replaced by church attendance and fixed rituals. The body no longer had to move for the soul to grow, or so we were told. And then came the 20th century. Suburbia, resumes, HR departments. Settling down wasn't just encouraged. It became the very definition of success. A steady job, a home, a retirement plan. Wandering? That became failure. Burnout, crisis. We traded the unknown for the stable. And in doing so, we lost something enormous. The space between identities, the rite of passage, the spiritual pressure of dislocation. We believed the lie that wisdom could come while staying still, as long as we read enough, consumed enough, watched enough. But what happens when modern people try to bring this ancient wandering wisdom back? Some succeed, many don't. And the difference usually comes down to intention. Take Christopher McCandless, the American traveler immortalized in Into the Wild. In the 1990s, he gave away his savings, abandoned his car, and set out to live in radical simplicity. On the surface, it echoed the path of Diogenes or the sannyasins. But McCandless died alone in an abandoned bus in Alaska. His journals reveal awe, but also confusion, a romantic ideal with no structure, a longing for detachment without a destination. Compare that to someone like Satish Kumar, a former Jain monk who in 1962 walked 8,000 miles from India to Washington, D.C. to promote peace. He carried no money, slept where he could. But he wasn't fleeing. He was offering. His walk was part of a lineage, a tradition that gave his journey shape. Today, he teaches ecology and nonviolence in England. He returned. Even in less extreme cases, the wandering instinct persists. Digital nomads, gap year seekers, Camino de Santiago pilgrims, retreat hoppers, psychedelic tourism. There's a real desire to break free, but often it's commodified. We pay for retreats the way we pay for spa days, The ritual becomes a package. The discomfort is controlled. The ego remains intact. Still, there are glimpses of revival. Therapists now talk about liminal space and rites of passage as essential for transformation. Neuroscience supports the idea that unfamiliar environments can interrupt old patterns and unlock new insights. Walking, long undervalued, is now being studied as a cognitive enhancer. Nomadic tribes, once dismissed as primitive, are being reevaluated as deeply adaptive. In short, modern attempts to reclaim the wandering path are often shallow, but the hunger behind them is real. We crave disruption, we crave reorientation, and deep down, many of us sense what ancient wisdom knew. The road does change you, but only if you let it strip you down, not just of things, but of stories. So, how do we bring this ancient approach into modern life, without pretending we live in deserts, temples, or 11th century Baghdad? The key is to adapt the principles, not copy the form. We don't need to renounce everything or vanish into the wilderness, but we do need to reintroduce intentional dislocation, moments that interrupt our default identities and routines. Here's how. 1. Micro-wandering. Schedule deliberate periods of being unavailable, not to rest, but to rediscover. Walk a part of your city you've never been to. Stay somewhere without Wi-Fi for 48 hours. Take a train with no productivity plan. Let yourself be unanchored, even briefly. 2. Design your own rites. In traditional cultures, a life transition often involved a journey, a literal movement from one place to another to mark internal change. Today, most people go from college to career, from breakup to rebound, without pausing. Instead, create your own threshold. When something ends, leave, even if it's just for a week. Mark the shift with space. 3. Reverse the goal. Modern travel often reinforces control, itineraries, ratings, plans. Ancient wandering was the opposite. No map, no timeline, no fixed identity. So next time you travel, let the purpose be discovery, not efficiency. Who are you when no one expects anything from you? 4. Create detachment zones. Even in daily life, you can carve out zones that mirror the ancient method. Silence before sunrise. Walking without headphones. Spaces in your home with no screens, no clocks. Let parts of your environment stop reflecting your ego and start reflecting your attention. 5. Join or build temporary circles. Remember, the wandering sages weren't always alone. They connected with others in temporary but meaningful ways. You can replicate this by joining retreats, salons, discussion circles, places where roles drop and real dialogue emerges, not forever, just enough to disrupt the script. The truth is, we don't need to flee modern life, but we do need to question its rigidity. Wandering isn't about chaos, it's about humility. The humility to admit you don't know, and the courage to step into that unknown again and again. Even in small ways, we can make room for movement, not as distraction, but as method. So what does all this reveal? Not just about individuals who wandered, but about us, about the kind of world we've built. It shows us that stability, the thing we've been taught to crave, may not be the peak of human evolution, but a detour. That stillness, when forced or habitual, can be more dangerous than chaos. Because when every part of your life is locked into place, your job, your address, your reputation, your timeline, what room is left for reinvention? The ancient world, with all its hardships, carved out space for people to become, to not know who they were for a while, to question, to go out and come back different. Modern life doesn't just discourage this, it fears it. There's no field in your resume for year I got lost and found clarity. No line on your dating profile for season of solitude that changed everything. And yet, those are the moments that shape us. The wandering sages understood something modern culture tries to suppress. That meaning is not found in accumulation, but in shedding. That wisdom doesn't grow inside echo chambers, but at the edge of discomfort. That the soul, like a muscle, needs movement to stay alive. This isn't about rejecting civilization. It's about remembering what civilization forgot. That growth is seasonal. That confusion is sacred. That the person who leaves is rarely the same as the one who returns. So the deeper question becomes, what if progress isn't a straight line? What if it's a spiral? And every so often, you have to circle away in order to come back wiser? Maybe the true opposite of distraction isn't focus. Maybe it's pilgrimage. So what does it all come down to? This. The wisest people in history didn't settle down, not because they couldn't, but because they chose not to. They knew something we've forgotten, that comfort can be a cage, that roles can become prisons, that the surest way to lose yourself is to cling too tightly to who you think you are. Across 10 sections, we've seen how ancient cultures honored the wanderer, how men like Al-Ghazali walked away not in weakness, but in search of something deeper, how movement, literal and spiritual, served as a method of transformation, and how our modern obsession with security may be costing us the very thing we crave most, meaning. So here's one action you can take. Don't sell your house. Don't quit your job, but interrupt your pattern. Take a walk with no phone, travel with no plan. Sit somewhere unfamiliar, long enough to feel like a stranger to yourself. And in that unfamiliarity, listen, not for noise, but for the faint voice that only speaks when everything else goes quiet. The one that asks not, what should I be doing, but who am I when no one's watching? Maybe wisdom doesn't arrive with answers, but with better questions. And maybe the most important one is this. If staying still hasn't made you wise, what might happen if you started to move?